This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on is the Iranian regime is in trouble. The Iranian people are rising up in the streets of Tehran and other cities, and they are, in some cases, engaged in taking out regime leaders. I think they went after one colonel of the IRGC, found his home, and took him out in his home after he had ordered the shooting of some protesters. This is heating up in Iran. President Donald Trump has drawn a red line. And his red line is, if the Iranian regime starts killing people in large numbers, then we are going to defend them. And, you know, I remember when Barack Obama drew a red line in Syria. He said to the Syrian regime, if you start killing your people with chemical weapons, there will be military consequences. And then he failed to enforce that red line. And it actually took Donald Trump in his first term to come in and enforce that red line twice, bombing Syria twice for using chemical weapons against his people. So Obama undermined American deterrence by drawing a red line and not enforcing it. And then Trump restored American deterrence by enforcing Obama's red line. Now Trump has drawn a red line himself. And I just can't imagine, we're recording this on Monday evening. We're going to try and put it out on Tuesday because we're not going to let it sit until Thursday. And I think it's entirely possible that before this comes out or soon thereafter, Donald Trump's going to do something to enforce that red line, because he is not Barack Obama. He has spent his first year in office restoring America's deterrent after it was dissipated under Joe Biden. And I just can't imagine for whether you love him or hate him, whether you like what he says or don't like what he says, he tends to do what he says, right? Whether for better or for worse. And so if he's going to draw this red line with the regime, I can't imagine a circumstance under which he pulls an Obama and doesn't follow through in some way.
I hope you're right. I really do. I hope that Donald Trump sees the opportunity here, because that's what this is. You and I often talk about this. One of the things that, funnily enough, the Iraq Liberation Act was supporting the Iraqi people in overthrowing their regime. One of the things that the Reagan Doctrine was about was supporting people who wanted their own freedom. It wasn't putting American boots on the ground in every place where we saw danger, where we saw a threat. It was finding the right people and giving them the means to deliver for themselves their own freedom. Iranians are taking their lives in their hands, right? They know that there are shoot-to-kill orders. They know, because they've heard it from the regime, that there are executions that are going to be happening if they have not happened already, and they are still out. Mark, I just retweeted or re-X'd or whatever the hell you say, a video of what is happening in Tehran tonight, Monday night. People are still out there. People are still fighting for their freedom, even in the face of possible death. That is a moment when you step in. And if Donald Trump is able to deliver a new Venezuela and a new Iran and potentially help save Ukraine from Russia, all I can say is, yeah, there are a lot of things he does that I don't like, but amen to him, credit. So I hope he realizes what the opportunity is and isn't lured by the blandishments that Iran's foreign minister and Iran's leadership is making to his team right now, begging for dialogue and diplomacy, because we know what they'll do with that.
Well, he's a good negotiator, so he knows when his negotiating partner is desperate. So it's interesting that they weren't coming to him 6 months ago or 8 months ago, or in the first months of his presidency when he offered them the chance to do it. So I think the deal, as Darth Vader said, the deal has been altered. Pray I do not alter it further. is what I hope he's saying to the Iranian regime. But also, let's go up 30,000 feet here and think about this. So it is entirely possible that this year you could see a free Venezuela, a free Cuba, and a free Iran. That is a tantalizing possibility. If Donald Trump were to make that possible and to do it without boots on the ground, without getting us dragged into another forever war, as we're constantly warned that we don't want to get into, I think he can. He would go down in history as the greatest freedom president since Ronald Reagan. The opportunity there is tantalizing. I mean, if you think about just Cuba for a second, Cuba has survived every American president since Eisenhower. I think Donald Trump would love to be the president who breaks that streak. I think the Cuban regime could fall now that he's cutting off all of its oil. I think that Donald Trump wants to be the president who ends the Iranian nuclear threat forever. The best way to do that is to end the regime that's pursuing nuclear weapons and help the Iranian people end it. And in terms of escalation and all these warnings of escalation, I don't know that there's anything that he could do in Iran right now that would be more escalatory than taking out Fordo and killing Qasem Soleimani. Except the difference between now and when he killed Qasem Soleimani in his first term is the regime is weaker than it's ever been. Right? They've lost their ballistic missiles. They've lost their air defenses. They've lost their enrichment facilities. They've lost their Syrian ally. They've lost the Hezbollah. The Hamas is under threat. I mean, their terror network is decimated. This regime is on its back. And you only get an opportunity like that every so often. And I wouldn't suggest that he go out and searching for this, but now that the Iranian people have stepped up and are trying to end this regime, let's help them do it.
Look, I agree with you. Let's absolutely help them do it. I'm less confident in the president than you are because I'm watching Venezuela and I'm nervous. But I also recognize that he needs time. I don't think he's as good a negotiator as he thinks he is. But again, this would be Nobel Peace Prize material. I agree with you entirely.
So at the end of our last podcast, we were talking a little bit about conservative foreign policy, and I wanted to pick it up because I think it's in play here. After when Trump came into office in his first term, he campaigned against the foreign adventurism of both Republican and Democratic administrations, and I think a lot of the isolationist right thought, "Oh, we're going to be in charge now. We're going to pull back, and we're going to stop all this foreign adventurism and American getting involved in foreign stuff and focus on things at home." And then he bombed Syria twice, and he killed Qasem Soleimani, and he authorized the U.S. to kill all the Wagner fighters in Syria, and he launched a cyber attack on Russia, and he did all these things that they didn't particularly like, and they rationalized and they said, well, you know what, he didn't know what he was doing in his first term, so he brought in all these globalists. So we're going to get rid of the globalists, right? And the globalists are who are dragging Trump into all of these things, and so we're going to purge them. So we're going to get rid of Mike Waltz, and we're going to stop these people from getting national security positions. So they did that, and what has he done? He bombed the Houthis. He bombed Iran. He's bombed Nigeria. He's bombed Venezuela. I mean, just the list of things that he's done. He's done more. He's been more aggressive on the world stage in his first 12 months of his presidency than he was in all 4 years in the second term than he was in all 4 years of the first. And I think what he's doing here is forging. There's two ways to respond to the American desire not to have boots on the ground that comes out of the Iraq and Afghan wars and the end of those wars. And one is the sort of the Bridge Colby Vance wing of the party, which is pull back, stop getting involved in this foreign policy stuff, and focus on our problems here at home. And what Trump is doing is forging another way to lead on the world stage. And it's complicated. It's hard to dictate what's happening in Venezuela when you're not like George H.W. Bush sending tens of thousands of ground troops to occupy Panama, where you can basically, install whoever the hell you want, right? So I think he's in a stage right now where he is flexing America's military muscle and forging a different direction forward in terms of American and conservative international leadership. And I think we need to give him some space and give him some grace to try and figure that out, because the alternative isn't to go back to the way, the way things were done before. The alternative is to just pull back from the world. And so I think we all ought to be rooting for him to succeed, trying to help him succeed, because he's trying to lead. and we may have some quibbles with how some decisions he made and how he's doing it, but it's good for the country that we have a president who wants to lead on the world stage and thinks foreign policy is important, even when people are complaining that things are not going well at home with the economy and other things like that. He still isn't distracted by that. He's addressing those problems, but he's not pulling back from the world as a lot of people are advising him to, and I think that's good.
I agree with all of that, Mark. The only thing that worries me is timing. The longer that we hold off, the more likely it is that the regime is able to resecure control of the country in Iran. They have the guns, they have the power, and time is their friend, not the friend of freedom. And so while I completely understand what you're saying and am pretty sympathetic, the president can't dilly-dally because this opportunity is going to disappear. Anyway, we talk about all of this with our colleague Michael Rubin, who is probably known to most of our listeners. He's a senior fellow at AEI. He specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East, but he's actually been doing a ton of work on Africa and Armenia and Azerbaijan as well. He's also the director of policy analysis at the Middle East Forum. He worked in the Pentagon when Mark was in the government. He's lived in Iran. He's lived in Yemen. He's worked in Iraq. He spent time with the Taliban. He has horrible, horrible taste both in residences and in friends to hang around with, but he knows these people like the back of his hand and is a delight to talk to.
Are you talking about us? Because we're his friends.
Well, that's true. I think we're the exception. I was talking more about the Taliban, Mark.
Here's our interview. Well, Michael, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mark.
So great to have you. So give us just for our listeners who don't spend all their time like Danny following everything that happens in Iran. Talk to us about how this protest started. And how does why does the regime feel so threatened at this particular moment? Because there have been protests before that haven't really freaked them out quite as much as they seem to be freaked out right now. Talk to us about how this started and what it means.
Well, you're right. There have been protests before, and a lot of them have involved the elites, the people who bothered to vote, people who had the university students and so forth. What made this different is it started off in the Tehran Bazaar. The Tehran Bazaar is normally very religious, also very conservative. And so really,
What is the Tehran Bazaar?
Basically, you can think of it as the lungs of the economy. And Iran is a country without the huge industrial conglomerates outside the Revolutionary Guard. And so the Tehran Bazaar, both economically and historically, has an outsized role. The point is, this wasn't a university women striking or protesting. These were the people who were the traditional constituents of the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. These are people whose brothers or cousins were Islamic Revolutionary Guard corps men. The point is, when inflation is reaching 40%, when the currency is crashing to be near worthless, we're talking getting close to Zimbabwe levels, then you've got a situation where even if you're a Revolutionary Guardsman, even if you're technically a regime loyalist, you still got to put food on the table.
Michael, so one thing that I think is an interesting comparison is that when the Shah fell in 1979, yes, partly it was the security forces abandoning him that led to his ouster, but the Bazaris, who are, as you say, the backbone of the Iranian economy, they also turned on him, I think, much to their regret later on. So tell us, we're talking at a particular point in time, and I hope our listeners know this is very fluid. Things are going back and forth, and we don't have great visibility into Iran because there has been a multi-day total internet cutoff, massive state-level sophisticated jamming of Starlink. So it's very hard for people to get information out. But with all those caveats, what do you think is happening right now?
Okay, you're absolutely right about the Islamic Revolution in 1979 actually kicking off with a strike in the Tehran Bazaar. But I'll do you more. The Mossadegh protests, Tehran Bazaar. Likewise, the 1905 Constitutional Revolution started in the Tehran Bazaar. That's why this is so important right now. Now, what's basically going on is this is no longer just a protest. We've seen reports now confirmed of security force colonels who have been killed, people who were involved in crushing earlier protest movements, hunted down and killed. This is a full-scale revolution, and the regime is responding in kind. The big question, of course, is whether the Islamic Revolutionary Guard is going to sit on the fence, whether it's going to fire on their countrymen. You add into this mix a couple things. The Revolutionary Guard has a lot to lose. I'm going to push back on something you said, Danny. You said state-level jamming across Starlink. Some Starlink terminals are working. What's not working are the Starlink terminals that most people in Iran had, which were sold to them by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fronted companies. So when you have the Revolutionary Guard sitting on the fence, some of them have decided to take their list of who has these terminals and go door to door and reclaim them. But those which were infiltrated through non-Iranian sources seem still to be working.
So what sparked it? I mean, I know that the conditions are bad, the inflation is bad, the currency is spiraling, but was there a moment that was it the son of the Shah calling on them to stand up, to rise up, or what caused this to happen right now?
You know, that's something historians are going to have to parse, Mark, but when you have the currency fall to the point where it's declining in value 5 or 10% every day, ultimately people are going to protest. So maybe it was some random fruit vendor like in Tunisia who set himself on fire. I mean, that's more of a analogy. We may not know exactly what caused it in this case, but the outrage grew. Now, one of the other things we need to look at, however, is the Iranians have also learned their lesson from the past. When Danny said, what are they doing now? In the past, they simply bashed heads. Now, what oftentimes the Iranians do is they will take photos, they will identify people, and then afterwards they round people up and increasingly either torture or execute them. This is one of the reasons why perhaps everyone feels that it's all in, this is the last best chance. At the same time, hovering in the distance is the fact that the Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, he's close to 87 years old, he's had cancer, he's partially paralyzed, and people are maneuvering to succeed him. The latest news is that, and I think Donald Trump has confirmed this somewhat, is Mohammad Javad Zarif has talked about launching new negotiations. And the question is whether we're going to have a Venezuela model break out in Iran. And when it comes to this idea of the spark that caused this, will the Iranians put up with a Venezuela model when it's the management of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps which led the regime to this horrible situation in the first place?
So before we start talking about, about Venezuela models or full overthrow, let's talk a little bit more about where things were in Iran. First of all, I think most of our listeners are aware that Iran really has never been so weak. The October 7th may have been bad for the Israelis, but at the end of the day, with Bashar al-Assad gone in Syria, with Hezbollah weakened, though trying to reconstitute itself, with Hamas weakened, though trying to reconstitute itself, with the Houthis really left, along with perhaps the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashd-e-Shaabi, as the only intact Iranian proxy movements, plus, of course, the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran last summer. The regime is in an unprecedentedly weak position. So that's sort of the other state of play, plus the political scenario that you described. Okay, you've talked about who the opposition are, but what do they want?
That's the big question. And basically what the opposition wants is for every other opposition figure to bow down before them. This is ultimately going to be the big problem. But one issue which you didn't mention in that very accurate litany of just how bad the Iranian situation is. Yeah, Bashar al-Assad fell. Yeah, Maduro's no more. But remember, the Iranians had about, according to some estimates, $200 billion worth of outstanding loans and contracts with the Assad regime. They had, according to some sources, up to $30 billion in loans and contracts to the Maduro regime, none of which are now going to be repaid. So when Mark was asking what sparked this, just in the last couple weeks, we've seen any sense of optimism that things could get better get flushed down the Tehran toilet. So when it comes to the opposition, you're absolutely right. And the opposition traditionally has been like herding cats. The one thing we can say is that Reza Pahlavi does have name recognition. The question is whether Reza Pahlavi is more of a white Russian leader who wants to talk about opposition from outside but is afraid to come back, or whether he can actually capitalize on his name recognition, on this brand, the grass is always greener on the other side, on this pre-revolutionary nostalgia to actually achieve something. But Danny, when we're moving forward, what my fear is, in 2007, the Revolutionary Guard reorganized to focus inward on repression. They put one unit in every province. I would guess that each of the Iranian provinces has an arms cache. The question is there going to be a mad scramble for these various arm caches? And if that's the case, no matter what the opposition might want, could we have a situation like Libya where suddenly it's a mad scramble for these arms? And as Mark remembers from 2004, John Kerry's attempt at an October surprise was to accuse George W. Bush of not taking care of these various arms caches and letting the insurgency rage. In Iran is a much larger country, and it's awash with arms. So this is something to watch very, very carefully.
So there's a lot to unpack there, Michael. I want to follow up and talk to you about Reza Pahlavi. You and I both know him. I think he's a good man, and I say that cautiously. There are, as you rightly say, every citizen of Iran thinks that they are the would-be next leader of Iran. But he has not been overly pretentious. He has made calls to overthrow the regime, but he says that he would hope that he could be a transitional leader. So talk a little bit, A, about your assessment about the quality and nature of his support inside Iran, and B, about who other contenders might be, including, as you rightly mentioned, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Okay, well, first of all, Danny, I think I've mentioned this anecdote to you before. I've never mentioned it to Mark. But about 15 years ago, I attended a very good friend's wedding on Fisher Island off Miami Beach. And it was on Fisher Island because Reza Pahlavi was going to be the best man. Now, my friend, who came from a family which was associated with the Pahlavis traditionally, was marrying a woman who came from a family which was traditionally Tudeh. These are the guys who were leftists. They were close to the Soviet Union. They were supporters of Mohammad Mossadegh. They were anti-monarchists. Well, it was on Fisher Island for security because cars couldn't get on the island and so forth. And a lot of her family were coming in from Iran and had no idea that Reza Pahlavi would be there. And when they saw Reza Pahlavi at this relatively small wedding, to a man and a woman, they got down on their knees. They cried. They wanted to kiss his hand. And these are people that were traditionally anti-monarchists. So you can't underestimate this nostalgia for the way things were. Now, in reality, the way things were under the Shah was Iran was a dictatorship. And Reza Pahlavi understands that his father was a dictator. So perhaps the pendulum shifted too far in the other direction, where Reza Pahlavi, instead of being decisive, decided to try to promote himself as a coalition builder. Now, this started to change about 2 years ago. There was an opposition attempt at creating a broader coalition at Georgetown University, and at the last minute, Reza Pahlavi broke away from it because he didn't want to subordinate himself or share, and a lot of people accused him of being the spoiler here. But in hindsight, without a doubt, he is the most prestigious, and others who were at the Georgetown coalition have faded into obscurity. There's also another dynamic here that Reza Pahlavi has never made compromises with the regime, although some of his staff members have, whereas many of the other opposition figures were either reformist journalists or reformist politicians themselves. And it seems that the Iranians are turning against anyone who had association with the Islamic Republic. I wanted to say a previous regime, but I don't want to get ahead of myself there. The other issue to keep in mind, however, is that Iran is very fractious. And the Islamic Republic has crushed much of the civil society. The question now is whether you need a figure from outside like Reza Pahlavi, if only to have some sort of unitary vision across ethnicity, across political spheres, in order to have a constitutional convention or something like that. Whether you need a figurehead. Think about the transition in Spain from Franco to the democracy. It was because of, the king played an outsized role in that. The counterpoint to this, however, there's always a counterpoint, is Ayatollah Khomeini had once talked about how, and I'm quoting him, "I have no interest in personal power. All I want is a democracy." And as soon as he got back, that all went out the window. So there's deep-seated suspicion. Iranians are conspiratorial on the best of days, but this has just taken them to a whole new level.
What would happen? I mean, you described that scene in Fisher Island. Imagine that, but in Tehran.
Like, Mark, I've written on this.
If he showed up, if he snuck into the country and showed up, I mean, can you imagine what would happen?
Yes, I could. But again, you and I were both in the Bush administration. You at a very high level, and I was just a lowly peon. But you remember April 9th, 2003, the day that Baghdad fell. That was the headline. But the subheadline was what happened in Najaf that day, when Abdulmajid al-Hoy, who was a Western-leaning cleric that some elements of the American government put great hopes upon, came back to Najaf to sort of take over the shrine of Imam Ali. And he was set upon by a mob led by Muqtada al-Sadr's people. We didn't even know who Muqtada al-Sadr was at the time, who hacked him to death. Okay. And this is what must be going on in the back of the mind of Reza Pahlavi. Now, I've talked to some of the people around him, and the big fear is that he is going to be so cautious and reticent about going in until he can be sure of security, that he's actually going to create a situation that allows more insecurity to occur, because he's going to miss the moment to fill that vacuum.
So let's talk a little bit about options for the United States. The president has been very forthright, right? He has said, I stand with the people of Iran. Marco Rubio has said, I stand with the people of Iran. Now, the Iranians are, I was about to say they're not dumb. They've done a lot of dumb stuff, but they've done a lot of really shrewd stuff as well. And they've certainly played a reasonably poor hand extraordinarily well, especially once, we are aware of their military weakness. But, I read a really good piece by Andrew Fox this weekend, just talking about our military options. Getting rid of a nuclear program is much easier in some ways than using military force to aid and abet a revolution. And I'm trying to figure out, even if the president decides, and Lindsey Graham has suggested now twice that the president has decided to intervene militarily, what that could look like and what the implications would be. I also would love it if you would talk, and not necessarily in the order that I've asked it as well, about how Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, has very shrewdly raced to the United States and said they're ready for dialogue, they're ready for anything, they want to talk. And as a result, we saw the White House spokesman today say, obviously, for the president, diplomacy is the first option. Now, that's what that means. So, tell us what you think, how you assess this, and what you think the odds are and the prospects are for a military intervention actually helping the Iranian people.
Well, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And as you probably quipped behind my back before, I probably only get that right about half the time. That said, You've
I
got a
would say that to your
situation.
face, Michael.
I'm sorry. You've got a situation where past is precedent, and we've had similar debates before. There was the June 4th, 1989 crushing of Tiananmen Square. Although not too many people were talking about military action then, there was the issue about whether we should negotiate. And you remember that it was less than, I think, 2 weeks later, Brent Scowcroft and Lawrence Eagleburg secretly went to Beijing, and Brent Scowcroft was later seen clinking glasses with the Chinese foreign minister. We don't want that. You had February 15th, 1991, when George H.W. Bush, at a campaign stop in Massachusetts, I think at Raytheon, said, I call upon the people of Iraq to rise up and throw off the dictator Saddam Hussein. And they did. And then the United States stood down because realists surrounding him, Colin Powell and others, decided that, convinced George H.W. Bush this would be a bad thing to do. And we had another war 12 years later, and we had a great deal of bitterness. And our adversaries, especially Iran, were able to prepare for the future. This brings us to Donald Trump's original Truth Social post when he talked about how the Iranians shouldn't shoot protesters, even though it's part of their culture. And if they did, we would respond. We could go the route also of Barack Obama with his Syria red line. Now, if Donald Trump decides to actually make good on his rhetoric and enforce his red lines, unlike Barack Obama, then you've got a situation, you're right, what should his targets be? Now, I hope we have enough intelligence on this, but given that the Iranians have a pattern now of, after calm is restored, executing people before revolutionary tribunals. What you want to do is go after the revolutionary tribunals. You want to go after the judges. Now, when it comes to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, some are true believers, but some simply want better salaries. What you've got to do is go after the ones who are true believers without antagonizing the people who are only in it for the cash. You don't want to fall into the trap of, and this is what Khamenei's trying to drag us into, of creating a broader attack on Iran, which will create a national emergency and allow people to rally around the flag. A lot of people forget that in 1980, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that the Islamic Revolution was falling apart. Khomeini was able to pull it back together because of this national emergency. You don't want to fall into that trap. The other things you can do, go after these Revolutionary Guard arms caches. The big question, and the elephant in the room, is do you go after Ali Khamenei himself? I would argue, well, first of all, we know for a fact, through your sources, through my sources, that Donald Trump has traditionally been reticent about this. The reason being, he wanted a nuclear deal and he wanted someone to sign it. Many realists in the administration also don't want to create a vacuum. So if there's going to be a transfer of power, they want someone like Ali Khamenei to transfer that over. I think that's highly unrealistic, but, Washington comes up with its own theories. However, could you start going after his family members and close associates? People like Mujtaba Khamenei, the guy who knows where all the bodies are buried, where all the money is. Look, if you start knocking off Khamenei's family members one by one, what that would send the signal to Khamenei that, time's running out, and if he wants to preserve his family, he's got to act. The other thing, and Danny, you could tell me about the legality of this, or Mark could, but if you have areas of Iran which are liberated, and you have many Iranians, the kids of some of these officials, studying in the United States, Donald Trump is big into deportations. Why not say, we're going to round up some of these family members, cut off their visas, and deport them to liberated portions of Iran, and the liberated portions of Iran can decide what to do with them. That might create an incentive for some other defections. I would also give a statement, again, nonviolent, and say, hey, look, ultimately, you now have an opportunity. You can go into an embassy and turn yourself in, and then there will be amnesty. But if you don't, then ultimately, you're going to be held accountable. And remember, during the Constitutional Revolution, you had thousands of people inside the British Embassy seeking refuge. Why can't we try to replicate that today?
I love all your ideas, and I would quibble with Danny a little bit in the sense that like it's easier to knock off the Iranian nuclear program than it is to knock off the regime. I don't know that that Khomeini's bunker is as hardened as Fordo was. I mean, and that all these regime leaders are in more secure areas than the enriched uranium was. I think what the first thing you should do is just do a demonstration effect. And just to find the Iranian leader who's been the most vocal against the United States, warning us, "Don't you dare, or we'll make you pay." The sort of the same person who said Maduro, "Come and get me," right? And come and get him, and just knock him off, and just say, "Oh," or there's a IRGC facility where we know they're massing the troops to take down the protesters. Take it out, and say, "You ready to stand down yet?" And just we can do it.
You're absolutely right, Mark. When I was driving around Baghdad in 2003, shortly after the war, the active phase of the war had ended, what was amazing was to see how precise some of our targeting could be. So if you take something like Evin Prison, the major prison where political prisoners have been kept, where our own former colleague Jiue Wang was kept, you don't want to take a chance on killing the prisoners. But if you start taking out the guard towers one by one, that would be hugely symbolic throughout the regime. And so I do think we need to start talking about that. There's also an element of diplomacy. I worry very much that Qatar, in its desire to negotiate everything, is going to try to give the Islamic Republic an off-ramp, which actually is more of a cul-de-sac and leads right back to the Islamic Republic. I hope we wouldn't fall into a trap like that.
Is there a role for Israel here? So, I think a lot of people in Iran cheered when Israel and the United States operated together to take out the nuclear program, take out the ballistic missiles, take out the air defenses. I mean, and Israel certainly could take a lot more risky action on the ground than we'd be willing to as the United States. Is there a way for Israel to come to Iran's rescue?
The short answer is yes, and I would guess that perhaps the Israelis, simply because their intelligence isn't quite as bureaucratic as ours has become, perhaps have better on-the-ground granularity as to where people are and how to get at them. And so then the role of the United States becomes standing back and not interfering. And so the short answer is yes. And as I always like to point out to people, the Israeli Navy drives more German submarines than the German Navy does.
So, we do have operational limitations. We have capabilities in the region. It'll be very interesting to see, because we don't have an aircraft carrier or a carrier battle group in the Middle East at this time in the Med. We have 11 aircraft carriers. None of them are in the region. A lot of them are in dock, undergoing repairs or on their way to somewhere. But we have them in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And so what we would need to use probably is our base in Qatar. And of course, the Qataris are well-known promoters of the Islamic Republic. So that'll be very interesting to see. I'd love to hear you think a little bit about that, Michael. And another question for you as well. One of the things I've always worried about, and we addressed this sort of tangentially, but we didn't address this directly. One of the things I've always worried about is the fall of the mullahs, the clerics in Iran, and a coup d'etat by the military, by the IRGC, taking over, abolishing not the constitution, not the system, but simply taking over the political roles. We've seen them in very important political roles. They obviously have a very important economic role as well, and they've got a lot of weapons. So on both fronts, what do you think?
Okay, first question. It's not just Qatar. I mean, look, I trust the Pakistanis about as much as I trust Ben Rhodes. But the fact of the matter is, Trump has managed to leverage the Pakistanis for whatever reasons. And the question would be whether the Pakistanis would seek to ingratiate himself by trying to come through Iran, by allowing us to use some of their facilities to come in the back door. So that's always a possibility. And then, while you're absolutely right about aircraft carriers, where are our LHDs, these basically amphibious assault vessels like the Iwo Jima and others that actually fly F-35 Joint Strike Fighters? Are they in the region? Remember also, Somaliland's been in the news, and I won't obsess about it, but when Carter tried to do his hostage rescue mission, initially, the place where whatever the special forces were called at the time had gathered in Berbera in what's now Somaliland, and so that's just a hop, skip, and a jump over to Iran. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, Sheikh Issa Air Base in Bahrain hosted 4 times more American aircraft than the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar hosts. So the capacity is there. The bigger question, and I agree with you that this is the question, Danny, is what happens to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I've said in other contexts that if you want to understand what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is, they became the elite force between 1980 and 1988 against the backdrop of the Iran-Iraq War. They didn't want to go into the barracks at the end of the war. So without moral equivalence, if you want to understand what they became, they took their equivalent to the Army Corps of Engineers and started investing in civilian enterprises. Today, if you want to understand the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, imagine the Army Corps of Engineers merges with KBR, Halliburton, and Bechtel, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Walmart. That's what the Revolutionary Guard has become. And then on top of which, of course, they have the military. So I say this as a Philadelphian, it's like 1930 Chicago or 2026 Chicago in the willingness of the Revolutionary Guard to make people offers they can't refuse. Instead of a horse head in the bed, put it this way, they become much more creative about beheading nowadays. The point of this is that this Revolutionary Guard has a conglomerate that's worth about $100 billion. And one of the reasons why, even without this uprising, it's going to be a free-for-all is when you have the Supreme Leader have a $100 billion commercial enterprise, you have the Revolutionary Guard have $100 billion, and then you have a transition, no one's going to want to subordinate themselves to the other, and everyone's going to look at like they're when you've only had one transition in 35 years, this is their opportunity to win the lottery, and if you don't win the lottery, you end up dead. And so you're going to have a massive scramble. Now, if the Supreme Leader falls, you still have the Revolutionary Guard, which is going to want to preserve its assets. The question is, can you strike a deal, even though this might be anathema, to allow them to keep some of their assets and perhaps flee to Russia? Or could you convince them that they can keep their assets, they can keep their corruption, and become basically like Egypt, a corrupt military dictatorship, but at least a corrupt military dictatorship that doesn't kill Jews? Where I think this idea is a little bit unrealistic is Americans are traditionally bad at understanding others' ideologies. We like to project. We like to think the best. We like to think that multiculturalism is about walking into a sushi restaurant and ordering a mojito. Fundamentally, however, we need to recognize that you can join the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps bubble when you're 8 years old because they have the equivalent of evil Boy Scouts. And then you remain in the Revolutionary Guard Corps bubble all the way up through the universities because the Revolutionary Guard controls some universities. And when we hear, for example, someone like the former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, rant and rave, we can think that's ridiculous. It's all tactical. But if that's what you've grown up in, that's the bubble, you may actually believe it. And that's what's really, really dangerous right now in trusting the Revolutionary Guard to cut a separate deal.
So first of all, mojitos are delicious, and I make a mean one. Danny can attest to that. Number one, and two, I think that when we killed Qasem Soleimani, I just don't see the risk to us in doing something and taking somebody out or taking some military action, because there's nobody other than the Ayatollah you could take out in the Iranian leadership who was more revered and more sacred to their movement than Qasem Soleimani. So what's the downside of acting?
I see no downside to acting. The big question is, if you remove the supreme leader and there's a vacuum, are you unleashing a free-for-all? And then what might that look like in the future? I mean, of course, Iran is 4 times the size in terms of population than Syria. So could you have Iran implode? Because again, we're not the only players in the sandbox, and you can bet whenever there's a transition, all the countries surrounding Iran are going to try to interfere. In fact, and this actually supports what you're saying, Mark, my worry consistently in a situation like this is the Americans like to preach about an even playing field. We're not going to interfere, which means that when there is a revolution or regime change in a country and everyone else has their finger on the scale, the only people who aren't supported are the ones who would lead to an outcome most conducive to our vision. I worry about that in Iran as well.
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, there's a lot to worry about. On the other hand, we have avoided military action in a whole series of places, as you rightly laid out a little bit earlier in our conversation, because we couldn't predict the outcome. And, the bottom line is you don't join military action because you know 100% what the outcome is going to be. That's not why we joined World War II. That's not why we've gone in almost anywhere. It is to optimize the options for our own national security and for freedom. So, that's critically
but
important.
Danny, nobody's talking about doing World War II here. We're talking about, standoff strikes.
Right. I know.
About
I
American
get that.
boots on the ground, and I just think it's important for people to realize. I think, and we had this conversation the other day, and I wrote a column about it in the Washington Post. But I'd be interested in Michael's thought on this. I think that Donald Trump is pioneering a different kind of conservative internationalism right now. Because, and I use the term conservative internationalism with hesitation because, of course, the isolationists hate that, right? But after, when Reagan came in after the Vietnam War, there was no appetite for putting boots on the ground. And so he pioneered the Reagan Doctrine as a way to advance American interests around the world, right? And he had to come up with something other than U.S. boots on the ground. And we're in a very similar situation now after Iraq and Afghanistan, where there's no public support for putting boots on the ground, and we have a president who criticized us for putting boots on the ground. But he's, the options are, one, withdraw and just let the world burn, and we focus on problems here at home, which I think there's a faction in the modern Republican Party who would love nothing better than that. And Trump seems to be doing the opposite, which is, he's bombed 8 countries in his first 12 months in office. He seems to be pioneering a new way of sort of flexing American military might without putting boots on the ground, and sort of letting some chaos reign, and then if we have to hit him again, we can hit him again. It's what he said to Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. Is like, well, if she doesn't do what I tell her, then she could have the same fate as Maduro. Does that option viable in Iran?
I mean, the option exists, but what I worry about, of course, is the difference being that Ronald Reagan had an appreciation for freedom and liberty, and I'm not sure whether Donald Trump has the same priorities. And then it becomes a situation, if George W. Bush, when he decapitated the Saddam Hussein regime, replaced Saddam Hussein with Uday or Qusay, or a Republican Guard general, would we have simply set the clock down ticking towards another conflict, or would we be where we are with Iraq today? And this isn't, you, Danny, and I know this, but Iraq has really turned the corner in a way that most Americans don't appreciate, because we still see it as 2003, never mind that 80% of Iraqis were born after the war. The fact of the matter is, I worry about Donald Trump thinking in the short term. Now, but if I may, let me look at the 20,000 foot level. And, Danny's probably heard me tell this joke before about the difference, an old Soviet joke, about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Soviet pessimist is the one who said, things have never been so bad. War, the environment, health, the economy, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Soviet optimist is the one who says, no, they can always get worse. But I'm going to give actually a real optimistic take. What's happening right now strikes me as being as significant as we've seen some waves in the Middle East. 1952, when Nasser took over and all the Arab nationalism, all the monarchies fell and so forth. 1979, the Islamic Republic and the waves of chaos. 2011, the Arab Spring. Now we have, if the regime falls, what could be the follow-on effects? What happens in Iran doesn't stay in Iran. So if you have a situation where you have a smooth landing in Iran, and this is where I hope that Trump and Rubio have imagination, what could it mean in all these other countries which want to abandon their failed models? If Nasser unleashed a wave of overthrowing monarchies in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, could you have a wave of stabilizing monarchies return? And what would that mean for the region? I do think that, I wish our State Department and our White House had at times more imagination. In the way that Ronald Reagan had imagination when he stood before the Brandenburg Gate and he broke all diplomatic protocol by demanding Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump would have just sent a missile to tear it down.
And then build a casino in its place.
That's the era we're in right now. But you raise another interesting question I want to ask, because I asked about the role Israel could play. What about the role of Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states that are pro-American and really hate the Iranians and are really worried about the Iranians? Do they see an opportunity here to end this problem? And do you think that they're encouraging the United States to do something and to act?
Okay, this may not be popular to say, and we'll put it this way. Danny's had to deal over the past 20 some odd years with my various obsessions, although I'd say in my defense, my obsessions often turn out to be right. And one of my current obsessions is that Mohammed bin Salman is switching sides, and that he's starting to
I think a lot of people think that.
Yeah. He's starting to join. Well, okay, so I'm not unique. Thank you for crushing my ego once again. At any rate, this is what happens when I sit in my basement and don't talk to anyone, like an angry grandpa. At any rate, you've got a situation where if Qatar and Turkey join with Saudi Arabia and even give the death blow to the Islamic Republic of Iran, we may be witnessing the birth of a new sort of force which is going to tie our hands and stymie our security interests for decades to come. That's what I very much worry about.
Yeah, no, listen, I don't want to crush your ego. It's just I have been seeing a lot of people being very nervous about the position that Saudi Arabia is taking. We're seeing a little bit of that going on in Yemen right now. But that is another topic that we will dive into at some other point. Let one last question from me, and that is, the longer this goes on, there are two possibilities, right? The one is that the regime gets a handle on things. They started killing a lot of people. We've seen some incredibly troubling pictures from morgues, some incredibly troubling stories from Iranian families whose children have been murdered, people being not just shot at, but then shot at in the head and finished off. I don't think we have a handle on the number of people who have died, but I suspect it will creep up into the thousands if it has not already. What do you think? What do you think about the odds? You worried that the tide was turning for the regime to us recently. What do you think?
Put it this way: I hope for the best, plan for the worst, and I worry about that the sheer level of brutality.
This is not the commentary podcast.
I'm sorry.
This is not the commentary podcast. That's their opening song.
that I didn't realize.
Hope for the best, expect the worst.
Well, let me put it this way. If you start seeing a massive refugee flow out from Iran, that would be an indication that the regime has triumphed. I don't think you're going to have the regime triumph without having that refugee flow, because the Iranians know that they've stuck their necks out and that the Khamenei isn't going to be forgiving should things calm down. So ultimately, I think we've crossed the Rubicon. We can't go back to the status quo ante, and at the very least, I would hope that the United States is planning for that eventuality.
If you were sitting with Donald Trump right now, what would you tell him to do?
I would tell him to take out Mustafa Khamenei, and I would tell him, look, if we could be in a situation where we were able to snatch and grab Ali Khamenei, that would be a coup for the ages.
Woo, put him in a cell next to Maduro.
Yeah, absolutely. But ultimately, the Iranians need more communications, and the Iranians need consistency. We're in a TikTok generation or a Twitter generation where people have the attention span of monkeys high on cocaine. We can't actually continue to run foreign policy that way if we're going to be committed to the to Iran's freedom. We need to be committed to Iran's freedom.
Yes, that is a great point, because freedom is what matters. It's not simply a willingness to talk to us about their nuclear program. We need the Iranian people to take back their country, and
if they did, you'd end the nuclear program.
Oh no, you wouldn't.
Oh yeah, you would if we gave it to them.
Well, let's.
Well, I actually side with Danny on this one, but the point being, where I think we can all agree, the problem isn't the nukes as much as the people who would wield them.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. What we want is it would, and you know something, Mark, I think Michael and I would agree entirely about this. We have had multiple presidents who have said that they want to turn their back and pivot away from the Middle East, and none of them have been able to. With this, the fall of this regime would give the United States an opportunity to finally not turn our back, because I don't think that's the right approach, but to stop dealing with the Middle East as problem number one, because Iran is behind absolutely everything bad that has been going on in the region.
Could I actually give one short answer to Mark that I just thought of? And this goes back to Ace Lyons, who was one of Jimmy Carter's military. He was an admiral who was in charge of Pacific Command during the Carter era. He argued that the best way to release the hostages was to take the Karg oil terminal, Karg Island. And of course, your listeners know that the Persian Gulf is extremely narrow, it's extremely shallow, so these big super tankers can't actually get into port. They rely on these islands or these terminals, which are a few kilometers off the coast of Iran. 95% of Iran's oil exports go through the Karg oil terminal. Donald Trump is a fan of taking people's oil. Well, it's time Donald Trump take that oil terminal and turn off 95% of Iran's revenue.
I love it.
Love it. Great. On that note, Michael, thank you. As always, lots of detail, lots of history, and great insight. Well, I hope the next time we talk to you on this podcast, it will be about what happens in a free Iran.
From free Iran.
Even better.
Next year in Tehran.
There you go. Anyway, thanks. This was great.
Thanks.
So, Danny, what do you think?
So I think we've talked a lot about what's happening on the ground as much as we can, and it is very hard to see in and to figure out where things are going to head. But I've been very interested in watching the Shah. There are a lot of people who are very leery about allowing the son of the former leader, the son of a former dictator. He was a dictator, no question, a better one than the current ones, but still a dictator, back into the country, back into the leadership. But, I've learned a lot of lessons since Iraq. I've thought about this a lot since the fall of Assad in Syria. Sometimes you just got to go with it. Sometimes you've got to carpe the diem and try and ensure that the path forward is the best one, rather than nitpicking the many faults of the people who would take over. And so I guess my view about the Shah, or the Crown Prince as people call him, Reza Pahlavi, is if you can do it, if the people will respond to you, then that's great. We don't want to transition to another dictatorship. We don't want Maduro in a skirt or Maduro in a suit or any kind of version of that in Iran. But if the Shah offers a potential transition away from the Islamic Republic, that is all to the good. The guy's been living in Potomac. He hasn't learned that many bad lessons living near a Balducci's.
Though didn't Assad also live in London and practice dentistry before he became a...
not dentistry. That's another bad guy, Rand Paul. He was an optometrist. He was an optometrist. Right. He was an optometrist. But no, at the end of the day, he was his father's son. And I think that Reza Pahlavi is a different and a much better person, and frankly much more American.
So here's a question for you then. Your analysis started out with, we got to stop nitpicking these people and go with, go with the flow. What if it's somebody from the regime? What if it's somebody who wants to break? Like, if there's a faction of, because one of the, we were joking the other day about, in Venezuela, we don't want to have de-Baathification, right? I mean, is there somebody from within who could step forward and turn on the regime and sort of change things from within?
So this is a really, really interesting question, probably not one for the tail end of a podcast, but it's really, really hard to know. When Bashar al-Assad was murdering 500,000 Syrians with the help of the Russians and the Iranians and the Lebanese, at that point, my view was, if somebody in his cabinet would just shoot him, that is the right outcome, right? I don't care who it is, just not him. The worry that I have in Iran is that if you had, for example...
Also the leader of Syria, by the way, who's former al-Qaeda. And
right.
is now meeting in the White House with the president, right?
Right.
He was in a U.S. prison in Iraq a few years ago.
Yeah, and right, and we have yet to know whether he's going to be good, but
that's right.
He is better, but he is better than Assad, and the thing I worry about is that there are people in Iran who could be worse. So, it's a really hard question that I'm probably overthinking. The issue here is that the system of the Islamic Republic needs to be overthrown. It is the system that has to be overthrown. And what I fear is that somebody internal would maintain the system. And that is worrisome. It's not just one person to kill. Ayatollah Khamenei, if he dies, will not be the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mahmoud Pezeshkian, the president, if he dies, it will not be the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You need to get rid of the Islamic Republic. And I'm pretty open to whoever wants to get rid of it, but there are internal people who would not get rid of it. They would simply turn it into a military dictatorship that was a lot more dangerous than the one that we see now. So, I'm still nitpicking. I'm still the nitpicker that I said we shouldn't be. You're the nitpicker.
After you just warned us against nitpicking, you're nitpicking.
You are exactly right.
I think you were right. I think you were right the first time, and I think, look, a good outcome in any of these situations, be it Cuba, be it Venezuela, be it Iran, is a country run by people who don't wake up in the morning and think America's what's wrong with the world and we have to destroy them. I think that's a good starting point, and then everything else is gravy.
Hopefully that's right. Hopefully that's right. Look, Mark, what I don't want to see is a transition from Gorbachev to Putin.
That's true.
It's happened.
That's very true.
And
it has happened.
That is very hard to manage. But then again, let's get rid of these people. Let's get rid of these people and then try and be better about managing the outcome than we were in the former Soviet Union.
We have a lot more influence on who follows if we're the ones who eliminate the one who is.
That is for sure. That is for sure. I hope that you're right, and that's what you're telling the president. Anyway, more soon from us. We're writing on this. We're talking about it a lot. Michael Rubin's doing a ton of work as well, as is our Critical Threats project. So if you're looking for up-to-date information, tune in to their work. And thanks for being with us.
Talk to you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.